Welcome to the Fit Factor podcast, where we discuss health and fitness for those who may have mistakenly thought that their best, healthiest days were behind them. That's about to change. Well, welcome to the Fit Factor. This is technically, I guess, the second episode. Hopefully you got a chance to listen to episode number 1 and hear a little bit about my story, kind of where I came from. If you haven't had a chance to listen to that, I would encourage you to go back. In fact, it leads into where we're going today. So it wouldn't be the worst idea to go check out episode number 1, hear a little bit about what started this journey, what started this process, where this podcast even, how it even became a thing and why we're here. But here's, I guess technically today would be episode 2, but this is going to be the first recording that I'm going to do that has any real content to it that I want to offer to you guys. And it's interesting how the timing of this recording is happening in relationship to a couple of things, a couple of events that have happened over the last couple of days. And so I just feel like this is kind of a necessary and a timely conversation, because over the past 24 hours, I've had 2 situations come up just randomly from other people that have both been about this subject. So I told somebody last week, I think it was a book someone was mentioning to me last week. And then a couple of days later, somebody else recommended the same exact book. And I told that individual, I said, man, you're the second person to suggest this book in the last 2 days. And I feel like when it happens twice in that short of amount of period, there's a reason for it. And so I went out and got that book. Turned out it was a phenomenal find. And the timing of kind of getting that pushed into my life was perfect. And so this is a similar situation where I feel like 2 people in a 24-hour period, both kind of honing in on this topic is like, okay, this needs to be talked about because there might be somebody out there that needs to hear this. And so let's just dive in. We're going to dive in, and I hope that this speaks to you. And if it does, fantastic. If you know somebody that it might speak to, share it. That's the only thing I really ask on this podcast. I'm not going to charge you any money. There's no subscriptions. There's no entry fee. There's no tickets. You don't have to buy tickets to my podcast. All I ask is that you share it with some people that you think might find some value in it, that it might make a difference in their life. So I was on a phone call this morning. I got a call from one of my clients, and we were just kind of chit-chatting. And he said, oh, by the way, congratulations on your race yesterday. Now, yesterday, as the recording is happening right now, it's January the 16th, 2023. So yesterday on January the 15th was the 51st running of the Houston Marathon. And I participated in the half marathon. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that during multiple segments of this, not to talk about me, but really to try to just share some content with you and some concepts and hopefully help you out. But my client today says, he goes, man, congratulations on your race yesterday. Did you do a marathon? I said, no, I did the half marathon. He goes, how far is that? And I said, 13.1 miles. And immediately within the split second, he's like, dang, that's a long way. And it really got my attention because in that moment, I remembered yesterday at the end of my race, I had this epiphany. Now, backstory is necessary. I ran my first full marathon last January at the 50th edition of the Houston Marathon. All right. My first full and only time I've run a full marathon. If you don't know, a full marathon is 26.2 miles. I had spent about 4 months getting coached and trained for that event. I didn't just decide to run a full marathon and just try to wing it and figure it out. I went and found a coach here in the Houston area that had some expertise in training marathon runners and triathletes and whatnot. And so he trained me. And I remember at the beginning of that process thinking, golly, 26.2 miles, that's a long way. It just seemed so daunting at the time. I had done one half marathon prior to that race. So I felt pretty confident about the 13.1. But when I was told, hey, you're going to run 26.2 now, that just seems so daunting. Well, Kyle, who's the client that I had a conversation with today, when he said to me, man, that's a really long way, I had this thought that kind of went back to a thought I had yesterday when I finished my race. And the thought was this: 13.1 used to seem like a long way. But now, because I've done 26.2 and multiple 13.1s, yesterday at the end of my race, I was thinking, man, that just didn't even seem very long. And I remembered even thinking during the race, mile 4, mile 6, mile 7, I remember thinking, man, at mile 6, I've only got 7 miles left, only. And some people would think only 7 miles. Well, that's kind of the point of this conversation today, because when Kyle said what he did, it brought me back to the thoughts that I had yesterday. Our minds, our brains are pre-wired to protect us. Number one, the job of the brain is to protect us. But what it also tries to do is it tries to minimize effort, and it tries to minimize energy being used just out of a survival mechanism that we have no control over. And yesterday, I remember thinking back at the end of my race how originally I thought 13.1 was a long way, just like my friend Kyle, when he immediately said, man, that's a really long way. But then when I did 26.2, yesterday doing the 13.1 seemed easy. I had already proven to myself that I could do 26.2. So in my mind, 13.1 wasn't difficult. Now, why is that important? Far too many times we get presented with physical challenges, and we get presented with all sorts of challenges, but this is the fit factor. We're going to talk about health and fitness and exercise, and that's kind of the foundation of what we're talking about. So we're going to stay in that realm. Oftentimes we see a challenge in front of us that's fitness related, and in this instance, it's running. And if you're new to running, or if you're new to the fitness world, there might be some things that in your mind sound really difficult and really daunting, and maybe to a degree impossible. But what you will learn is if you will push yourself to do hard things and then successfully accomplish those hard things, your mind will then recognize that it's doable. And then you can push the envelope a little bit more and a little bit more and a little bit more. I'm reading a book right now called Never Finished by David Goggins. And if you don't know who David Goggins is a former Navy SEAL. He is often referred to as the toughest man alive, as the baddest man alive. The intentional suffering this man puts himself through to prove points to himself of what he's capable of is mind-boggling. For years, he was an ultra marathoner, and his longest run he had ever participated in was 100 miles. And at some point in this book, you can read about this. He gets invited or hears about a race in Moab, Utah that's 200, if I'm not mistaken, 240 miles. And even that to him seemed like, oh my God, I don't know, man, 240. He had already run 100. It's so wild. He could run 100 miles just on a given weekend, no problem, because he's done it before. But he was given the task of 240 miles, and that sounded overwhelming. If you read the book, you'll find out, well, no spoilers. Read the book. Phenomenal book. So his mind, my mind, your mind, we are pre-designed to be protected from things that could be dangerous and to conserve energy. So there's way too many times that our brain says that sounds really difficult, that if we'll just push into that thing and we'll work towards that thing, we will prove to ourselves what's capable, and then we can build on that. I remember it was August of 2019. I had already lost all my weight. I had completed my weight loss journey in July, on July 15th of 2019. And in August of 2019, I went to a little convention of sorts with some health coaches, some fellow health coaches. And I met a guy there named Marcus Ratcliffe. He sat in a row right in front of me. I can still see the room. We sat on the aisle, my wife and I. He and his wife sat on the aisle, front row. My wife and I were on the second row. And at the end of that session, he turned around to me and we just started having conversation. And through a few minutes of conversation, he says to me, "Hey man, let's get together for coffee. Let's just meet up and just talk. I'd love to get to know more about your story and know more about you." So we set that up, and I met him here in Houston at a coffee shop, and we just began to talk, get to know each other. He asked me about my story, and I just shared some of the details of what I had gone through and what I had come through to get to the point that I was at in August of 2019. And at some point in that conversation, he looked across to me and he said, "You should do a sprint triathlon." And I didn't have any clue what that even meant. I knew what a triathlon was, but I didn't know what a sprint was. I said, "What's a sprint triathlon?" He goes, "Man, all you have to do is swim 500 meters. You're going to bike 13 miles and you're going to run a 5K, which is a little over 3 miles." And I thought about it for a second and I thought, yeah, I think I can do that. And so that conversation started me on the journey that I'm currently on now. Why am I telling that story? About a week after this conversation, when I committed to doing a sprint triathlon, I stepped onto the track at the school I was working at the time in the Woodlands, Texas. Went out to the track for my very first run. I had not gone for a run or a jog in years. Started jogging around that track. And I was sharing this with my client today, Kyle. I said, "Do you know how far I ran on my very first training session?" And the answer to that question was 1 lap. I ran 1 lap around that track, a quarter of a mile, before I had to stop and walk and catch my breath. That's how physically out of shape I was. My conditioning was absolutely atrocious. I ran 1/4 of a mile, and I remember thinking to myself at the end of that day, and I think it was a Monday, I said, by Friday, I'm going to run a 1/2 mile without walking. And on that Friday, I ran a 1/2 mile without walking. And I left there and said, okay, on Monday, I'm going to run 3 laps without walking. And the following Friday, I'm going to run 1 mile without walking. On that Friday, I ran that mile without walking. And that was how my journey to running a full marathon last January started. My fitness journey started with a 1/4 of a mile. And 3 years later, 26.2. Now, I didn't go from a 1/4 of a mile to 26.2 in a couple of months. It took time. It took dedication. It took discipline. Discipline means you do the things you don't want to do because they need to get done anyway. I consider myself to be very disciplined, and I pound the drum of self-discipline harder than just about any drum that I pound, because you will not build trust in yourself until you prove to yourself that you can do hard things. And when you show up for yourself, you make promises to yourself that you keep. That's where self-esteem comes in. Self-esteem is not something that you get from other people. If it were, it wouldn't be called self-esteem. We build the esteem in ourselves by doing things that are hard. And so when I ran that half marathon yesterday and was on mile 4 and 6 and 7 thinking, man, I only have 7 more miles, or at the 4 mile mark, I only have 9 more miles. This is nothing. Believe me, that I didn't start there. I had to build to that in my mind. I had to prove to my mind, you can do this. And so if I can get across anything to you today, if you're a mom, if you're a dad, if you're looking to get in shape, if you're looking to get fit, shut your mind off. Don't listen to the lies of what's too hard. Push yourself to do things that you don't think you can do. And when you do those things and prove to yourself that it's capable, you're going to tell your mind, this is easy. And then you can push to that next level. All right. So I hope this is helpful for you guys. I hope there's something in here that you can take some value from. Our minds are designed to protect us and to conserve energy. Most of the time, they are our mind, when it tells us that something is big or too big or difficult, it's just doing its job. It's your job to take over that and actively and consciously think, I can do it anyway, and just shut that reactionary, that instinctive concept out of your brain. Shut it down. Shut it down. Go do the hard thing. Prove to yourself that you can do it, and then build on that thing. And you will look back a month, 6 months, a year, 3 years from now, and you'll be able to say, like me, I ran a quarter of a mile my very first time. Now look at where I've come. It started there. All right. So get out there, no excuses, build self-discipline in yourself, build self-esteem in yourself by showing up and doing the hard things and keeping commitments to yourself. And I promise you, you will not regret it.